Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, Hezbollah repels incursions in Lebanon as Iran's foreign minister heads to Saudi Arabia for talks to try and stop the conflict. At least 45 Palestinians have been killed and 130 injured in Israeli attacks over the past 24 hours as heavy fighting traps 400,000 in Gaza. President Biden cancels his visit to Ukraine's donor summit to focus on domestic issues. In southern Lebanon, Hezbollah reported repelling 2 Israeli military advances, though its efforts to gain ground have stalled, with 3 Israeli soldiers wounded in the clashes. And this comes as Iran's foreign minister visits Saudi Arabia in an effort to halt the escalating conflict. According to Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei, Tehran's top diplomat Abbas Araghchi will push for diplomatic solutions aimed at stopping what he described as the Israeli regime's genocide and aggression, and to help ease the suffering of people in Gaza and Lebanon. Well, for more on the situation on the ground in Lebanon, I'm joined by the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon, Imran Riza. So good of you to make time for us. Talk to me about what it's like in Beirut at the moment where you are, because overnight we heard Israeli airstrikes did continue, although some residents saying there appeared to be some less intensity, but I'm sure that doesn't come as much solace at the moment.
No, not at the moment. I mean, we've had, I think now 15 days, starting pretty much on the 23rd of September, of a really dramatic level of escalation. And it has progressively got, it's frankly got worse until, as you're saying, last night there was a bit of a respite on it, but today we've had quite a bit of shelling also happening in different areas. And of course, we also have what's happening on the ground in the south. But basically, the consequences of all of this have been catastrophic. Up till, I mean, we're at 1 year, right, today, since all this began in Lebanon. And until, I'd say, the 22nd of September, we had a total of about 110,000 people displaced from conflict. So over 11 and a half months, that's what we had. In the last 15 days, that number has risen to well over 600,000. As well as about 600,000 internally displaced within Lebanon and about 300,000 that have crossed into Syria. So we have well over 1 million that are affected and close to 1 million displaced from this.
It's an extraordinary number. And as a humanitarian coordinator, how do you handle something like that?
Well, at the moment, it's been about essentially, I would say that the overall ask that we have is for a ceasefire, right? We want the firing, the shooting to stop in this. But while this has been going on, the 2 main things that we have been trying to push for is first respect of international humanitarian law. We need to be able to access people. They need to be able to access us and assistance and safety. And so that's one aspect of that. And the other aspect of it is, of course, not putting civilians at risk, in danger, protection of civilians, trying to make sure that health workers are protected, that frontline workers are protected. And as we've seen, the level of casualties and fatalities amongst all of those groups has been enormous. So there is a call for protecting civilians, respecting international humanitarian law. Sorry, and then it's about resources. We were very underfunded even before this crisis. During the first 11 months of this crisis, we launched a flash appeal a week ago, 8 days ago, asking for $426 million. We need those resources. We need to be able to meet the health needs, the water needs, the food needs, the shelter needs, the protection needs, all of this, and that needs resources. We are fortunate, I would say, in a way, compared to 2006, because we have a lot of humanitarian agencies here. We have quite a humanitarian setup here. It needs the resources in order to function. And what we've also been doing a lot of is working very closely with the government response. And I think, as many of your viewers would know, the last 4 or 5 years have been years of crisis in Lebanon. The socioeconomic, the financial, COVID, the Beirut blast. People were exhausted after all of that, and then we get this particular crisis that's now lasted for a year, and we don't see the end in sight. So out of that, the government also doesn't have the resources, the strength, the capacity for what's needed right now. So we have to work very closely and support them and try and work together as we're going ahead.
That was going to be one of my questions to you, because obviously a caretaker government or a caretaker prime minister, certainly in Lebanon at the moment, and how coordinated they can be to work with humanitarian agencies. But as you're saying there, clearly the will is there and they're doing what they can. In terms of that number that you're trying to raise up, was it 426 million? How confident are you that you will achieve that?
I think the indications we've got from a lot of our sort of very reliable donors is very positive. And so there are a number, we've got more or less pledges to about half of that so far, but the actual funds that we've received are only around 56 million, about 12%. But I'm confident that they will come through and help us with this. At the same time, there's a lot of bilateral and in-kind donations and contributions happening. Over the last few days, we've seen a number of flights from the UAE, from the Emirates. Yesterday, there were flights, an air bridge that's starting with Qatar. And so a lot of supplies have started coming in that way. And just today, I was hearing that the EU will also start an air bridge to try to provide assistance in. And so that is extremely necessary, and it's welcome news.
You mentioned aid access before. That's been a persistent issue, certainly in Gaza over the last year. Foreign governments, even in the Western allied governments to Israel, who are still supplying funding for arms for ostensibly, they say, defence purposes. I'm thinking of the United Kingdom here, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, speaking in the last 24 hours, but also calling on Israel to ensure that there is access for aid agencies into Gaza. Now, we're talking about Gaza there. How concerned are you that that situation will be replicated in Lebanon?
We're trying to make sure that we have access. We're trying to make sure that we have contact with all parties to ensure that we have humanitarian access. And we'll have to see how it goes on. Over the last week, we have done a number of missions and convoys. Last Thursday or Friday, we had the first, the escalation started on the 23rd of September. And since then, until last Thursday, Friday, we were not able to take a lot of relief down to the south, to Tyre in this case. So there was a convoy that was arranged that had WFP, UNICEF, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Order of Malta, and OCHA, a number of our key partners going down there. And it was successful and it worked well. We're also trying to help partners of ours who are trying to arrange evacuations of people that want to leave. And here I'll stress that it's people that actually want to leave, and because there are many that don't want to leave and want to remain in their villages at this time. So there were a number of people, about 1,000 from Ain Ibil in the south, and it was the Order of Malta that was organizing that. So we tried to make sure that we have the right communication with parties to ensure that that safe movement can happen. So we're constantly doing this humanitarian notification, we call it. Some people call it deconfliction. Unfortunately, yesterday, with one of our partners, AMEL, which is an NGO that works throughout Lebanon, mainly in the health sector, and has been a key responder to everything that's been happening for years, frankly. It's one of the oldest NGOs. One of their educational institutions was struck yesterday. So it's, it just underlines still that we need to keep pushing as much as we can to have everyone respect international humanitarian law on this.
And before I return to talking about the efforts for a ceasefire, at least diplomatic channels being open, you mentioned there about people wanting to stay in their towns and their villages. Obviously, southern Lebanon being heavily impacted at the moment, Beirut as well. People, reports we're seeing, and you can tell us this, they're sleeping on the streets, they're sleeping in beaches, they're sleeping in Martyrs Square. Talk to us about that. Is that because they feel safer than inside buildings?
No, I think they're out because we don't have enough shelter at this time. I mean, we've already almost 1,000 schools that have been allocated as collective shelters. We, together with the government, and it's primarily the government on this, that is looking for all sorts of different space and how we can make that habitable. So a huge priority has obviously been shelter, and on a daily basis, we're having this discussion with the government at the Sarai, with all our technical expertise at their disposal on trying to see what we can do. I think a lot of people have now been moved into shelters. There are a lot of other people that are in empty apartments and other apartments or with relatives. A lot of our staff have a lot of relatives living in their apartments right now. A lot of our staff my colleagues are also displaced. So everyone is a bit in the same boat about this, and we're trying to find and agree on the right locations for this. And they have to be places where we can, very quickly deal with issues of water and sanitation and make sure that the right sort of assistance is being done, because otherwise you're going to have, and we've seen it in so many different situations, you're going to have an outbreak of disease.
Now, thank you for giving that detail, just so people can sort of reconnect with the human side of it. Let's think now about the diplomatic channels and the politics that's happening. Above everything else, we had another statement from Benjamin Netanyahu last night from Israel, basically calling on the Lebanese people to rise up against Hezbollah. And then it's expected today that the US President Joe Biden is going to be speaking or has spoken to Israel's Prime Minister. What are you thinking is happening at the political level here? Do you have any hopes that there will be pressure on any form of ceasefire?
Frankly, I am so concentrated as humanitarian coordinator on the humanitarian response and the humanitarian situation. There are other colleagues that are far more focused on that. What I can say is basically the two asks that we have on this is that those that can have influence on it, try to move towards a ceasefire. That's the obvious thing that we need in order to get to the situation where we talk about something sustainable. And in the case of this situation, it's obviously implementation of Resolution 1701. And the other ask is again, and I keep repeating it, is respect for international humanitarian law. Allow us to access people, allow them to access us, and protect civilians.
And understood that, day to day you're more focused there on ground level and what's needed. In terms of the locations of where you're dealing with, obviously we just mentioned Beirut, but talk to us about southern Lebanon as well, because a severe aerial bombardment, of course, from Israel on that area targeting Hezbollah sites, but also ground level clashes as well, lots of villages and towns affected. What's the situation like there?
I think the situation must be quite horrific. It is quite horrific down there. And there is a lot, there's been a huge increase in shelling, but one shouldn't discount how much shelling there has been also earlier. Now you have things happening on the ground as well. So there's been a great level of destruction, and that's something that we also need to track more, to have access and try to understand exactly what the level of it is, because we all hope for that day after when we start moving towards recovery and reconstruction. On the one side, you have to have the political process happening. On the other side, you have to help people get back to their homes and their livelihoods. What people have been so worried about, this this time, I was going to say this time, because it is different than 2006. In 2006, it was 34 days, 33 days. And very quickly things moved and there was recovery, reconstruction. This time it's been a year of this. And people haven't had the resilience, the buffer, the cushion that they had in 2006 because of the last 4 or 5 years of crisis, of impoverishment. I mean, this country has never been as impoverished as it's been in the last 5 years. So people need their livelihoods. They're very worried about the destruction of their houses. They're worried about their futures. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of trauma at this time.
I was going to ask you about that because we have spoken on this show to clinical psychologists out of Beirut about the trauma that's happening. But it leads me to think about, as you mentioned there, this has been a sort of year in the build-up. And of course, there was crossfire sort of attacks between Hezbollah and Israel over the course of the last year. But life continued almost as normal in Beirut. And certainly in the weeks leading up to the last few weeks, many of us who knew Lebanese people, those Lebanese people were trying to deliberate whether or not they should get out of Beirut if they had the means to, or get out of Lebanon if they had the means to. Of course, a lot of Lebanese cannot leave. What was that build-up like? Do you think anybody there actually thought it was going to get this bad?
I mean, clearly a lot of people didn't think it would get this bad. You had, as you were saying, a sort of almost a schizophrenia in the country at a certain point where a lot was going on and it was there was a certain pattern to it. People referred to it as tit for tat, but it was always escalating. Huh? We always did see that there was escalation happening on it. And amongst the humanitarians, amongst all of us, and the discussion also with different government counterparts was all about contingency planning. It was all about what happens when it gets worse and how do we move to that. I don't think any of us anticipated that it would happen as dramatically as it did on the 23rd, the number of strikes and the very huge level of displacement. But obviously that has also changed the situation, and people here in Beirut, people in the north, the Bekaa already earlier was suffering from this, but the whole of the south and the whole of the country is very affected right now by this. And I think you have the same level of anxiety about the future throughout the country now.
Are your fears that this will continue for longer than 2006? I mean, I appreciate we've just talked about it building up to a year, but I mean the most sort of aggressive conflict that we've seen in the last few weeks. Could it go on longer than a month, do you think?
I really don't know. Of course, none of us do. We know that the consequences already are huge. The humanitarian challenges are huge. We're all just trying to address these and trying to call on those that can to try to stop this now. We need it to stop.
United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon, Imran Riza, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Israel and Hezbollah have continued to exchange heavy gunfire as the Israel Defense Forces indicated a possible expansion of their ground military offensive in Lebanon, mobilizing their 1st Reserve Division to operate in the southwest region of the country. Now, this does come as heavy fighting continues, Israeli forces again invading northern Gaza as well. For more on Israel's war on two fronts, I'm joined now by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell from the United Kingdom. Sean, thanks for making time for us on this. And it's been a little while now, the conflict that we're seeing across Lebanon, certainly up to a year at this point in terms of the cross-border fire, but with really the ground clashes we're now seeing in southern Lebanon and the aerial bombardment across Lebanon by Israeli forces. Did you expect we would see the war opening up on a second front like this after the year we've seen in Gaza?
Yeah, good afternoon, Rosanna. Yeah, bluntly, yes. I mean, if you remember, after the heinous acts of the 7th of October, Israel focused its attention on Gaza. But once that operation had finished, it had been, through the last year, been constantly attacked from the north by Hezbollah because Iran has tried to arm its proxies to try to support Hamas. They knew that Hamas was going to get likely to be the wrong end of the fighting. And once the operation in Gaza has largely finished. Israel's pivoted to the north. The challenge now, of course, is to work out what are their objectives in the north. It seems to me that the operation up there by the Israelis is twofold, one of which is we're seeing precision strikes into Beirut itself, seemingly targeting Hezbollah leadership, command and control and weapons storage. And the second arm seems to be to try to recreate the buffer zone to the south of the country. For those who are interested, at the end of the other 2006 war, obviously there was a United Nations resolution 1701, which basically said Hezbollah go north of the Litani River, Israeli forces south of the Blue Line, and the buffer zone in between should only be populated by United Nations forces and Lebanese army. The trouble is, Hezbollah immediately moved into that area, and that has led to a compromise of the security of northern Israel. And Israel is clearly trying to clear Hezbollah out of that area, but it's a very difficult operation.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the sort of the ground operation, especially in southern Lebanon with you, but let's focus a moment on those aerial bombardments, because I know that's your area of expertise, a former airman yourself, retired Air Vice Marshal. When you say they're targeted aerial raids on buildings, obviously people have pointed out this has been on residential areas in Beirut, the Israeli forces and the Israeli Air Force saying, well, that's where the Hezbollah commanders have been hiding out. And of course, they have assassinated several of the top brass of Hezbollah through these airstrikes. So in your experience and expertise, how targeted have these airstrikes been?
Well, I think it's always going to be difficult when you're targeting in a residential area. And I think the tragedy is that clearly a lot of civilians have died. But what you also have to be aware that as a military operation, it's always intelligence led. And I think over the last few weeks, first of all, with the Israelis blowing up those pagers, then the walkie-talkies, and then systematically going after the Hezbollah leadership. And whilst it's very difficult to cross-check this information, but if you do one of those wiring diagrams of the Hezbollah command and control structure, it does appear that systematically Israel's been taking them out. And of course, most of them will probably be hidden away in bunkers underground. So I suspect what we're seeing is a lot of bunker buster type weapons being used. And it's just a testament, I think, in a way, to the intelligence of the Israelis that they've managed to infiltrate the Hezbollah command and control. They do appear to be putting Hezbollah on the back foot. The challenge, of course, is how far do they go? And of course, that when we were involved in similar operations in the military, there is a long-run conflict. You have to be very careful when civilian casualties are going to be involved. Clearly, at the moment, we're not seeing a vast array of those bombings. More seem to be specifically tailored strikes, but very difficult to know when that's going to stop.
And I appreciate you're more a military expert than a sort of a Hezbollah analyst or Hezbollah expert, but just from the military point of view, what type of impact does it have to take out the command structure of a military group like Hezbollah? What will that mean to the sort of the other ranks below?
The trouble is, from a command and control perspective, a lot of these groups are like hydras, quite frankly. You chop off a head, another one will grow back. And I think Hezbollah, one of their anointed sort of commentators, said that there were no vacancies available at the moment. In other words, they've quickly filled those slots up. The problem is, though, is that there is an established command and control chain, and Hezbollah will need that to be in place to mount any form of effective resistance against the Israeli attack. And at the moment, it's pretty clear that Hezbollah are on the back foot. There's even been suggestions that Hezbollah are looking for some form of ceasefire just to preserve. But let's be quite clear, there's no way that Israel is going to be able to destroy Hezbollah. They, unlike Hamas in Gaza, where Israel surrounded the area, Lebanon, Israel can't surround it. There's a ready flow of military weapons, ammunition and fighters that Iran can supply through Lebanon into support the Hezbollah fighters. So all that Israel can do really is to destroy the current framework and buy some breathing time. And the tragedy as a military guy is military operations only create the conditions for a political settlement to endure. What is that political settlement? What is the end game for the military? None of that is clear.
Interesting, yeah, and people talking about sort of Israel bombing people to get around a table. That sort of military route to diplomacy at the moment, so that they believe is required. In terms of returning just to the air capabilities here, because Israel's air capability is vast, it's strong, and when we saw Iranian missiles and Hezbollah missiles targeting various Israeli sites over the last week or so, they seem to be targeting air bases and seemed very set on, if they could, taking out Israel's F-35s. I don't know whether they have. That doesn't seem to have been confirmed. But you can imagine those would be pretty valued targets for Iran and Hezbollah.
Yes, I think let's take those two separately, Hezbollah and then Iran. There's no doubt Israel is the dominant military power in the region with its stealth fighters, as you say, the F-35. It's got a very complex array of weapon systems, missile systems, intelligence, satellite-based and drone technology, and of course is supported by the US. Hezbollah doesn't really have an answer to that. It has been an irritant on the side of Israel, firing rockets largely unguided, and the Iron Dome system is relatively good at defending against that. The most recent attack from Iran, those 180 ballistic missiles, unfortunately, fighter jets don't really have a capability to shoot those down. That is a very specialist task. It's a very expensive task. The Arrow system from Israel and, of course, the Patriot system from the US is really mainly, that's the main capability there. I think the worry for Iran, turning to Iran, is that Israel will do some form of retaliation. It could be military targets, it could be energy targets, but it also could be the nuclear facilities that Iran is trying to develop its nuclear weapon. Now, the US is very clear. It doesn't want Israel to attack those targets. But if you were Israel, you'd be saying, when, not if, Iran develops a nuclear weapon, that's going to present an existential threat to Israel. So diplomacy doesn't seem to have stopped Iran with its development. Therefore, it might well be that Israel decides to have a go. And if it does have a go, the stealth fighters are an asymmetric advantage that Israel has over Iran. And I have no doubt that they will form part of whatever strike they decide to do against Iran, specifically if they go after the nuclear facilities.
And just finally, Sean, I did promise to get back to talking about the ground fighting, especially that we're seeing in southern Lebanon. And some analysts are saying that Hezbollah, despite the force of the Israeli military, Hezbollah may have the upper hand when it comes to ground operations in southern Lebanon. What do you say to that?
Well, I think you have to look through it as a military guy. You study your history. 2006, the last war, the Israeli military are far dominant. But as soon as you go into territory like Lebanon, it's like putting your arm into a mangle. The further you go in, the more painful it is the more casualties you take. And bluntly, the Hezbollah have had 2 decades to plan for this exact eventuality. And there are all sorts of reports of them mining, setting booby traps, blowing up properties as soon as the Israeli forces go in. And this is into the buffer zone. This is before really Israel gets involved in any form of further move into the Lebanon. So bluntly, it's a question of how many casualties Israel's prepared to take. It does favour Hezbollah. Hezbollah will never win the battle, but they can certainly make it incredibly painful for the Israeli Defence Forces. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of that over the coming days and weeks.
Retired Air Vice Marshal, military expert Sean Bell, thanks so much for your insights. Well, we begin in Gaza, where the Health Ministry reports at least 45 Palestinians have been killed and 130 injured in Israeli attacks over the past 24 hours. Health officials have resisted Israeli directives to evacuate 3 hospitals, Kamal Adwan, Indonesian and Al Awda, despite receiving a 24-hour ultimatum. Intense fighting persists as Israeli forces launch another incursion into northern Gaza, leaving around 400,000 Palestinians trapped and raising concerns for their safety after most evacuation orders were largely disregarded. To discuss this, I'm joined by now Jacob Wallace, a former US diplomat who served as Consul General in Jerusalem during the George Bush and Obama administrations and later as US Ambassador to Tunisia under President Obama. He played a pivotal role in managing US relations in the region, particularly during key moments of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and Tunisia's post-revolution transition. Mr. Wallace, thank you very much for joining me. And let's talk about this dire situation that is being reported out of northern Gaza. Whilst all eyes at the moment are most of the time on Lebanon, of course, there is still attacks happening, this time in the Jabalia camp. And can you talk to me about what you think the strategy might be here?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think the key point is that Israel does not seem to have a strategy. Israel has obviously a very powerful military force, and they've done tremendous damage to Hamas over the past year, but they have not been able to eradicate Hamas completely. And Israel has no strategy for what to do. about the day after in Gaza. So that troubles me quite a bit. Without a strategy, you can win all the battles, but you can still lose the war.
That's really interesting. You say that. I don't often hear that in the interviews I'm doing at the moment, that you believe that there is no strategy for Israel. So what is it? Is it just reaction? Is it chaos? Is it that they have opened up too many fronts in the war? Is it push on their resources?
Well, I think Israel has the resources. And as I said, the military has achieved impressive tactical results. The problem is that what they've described as their objective, which is total victory, as Prime Minister Netanyahu put it, is simply not possible in a situation like Gaza, in an adversary like Hamas. Hamas is not a military force in the conventional sense. It is a militia in a sense, and it has deep support within the population of Gaza. So you can't eradicate a movement like that. You can certainly do damage to it militarily, but you need to have a plan for what to do after you've achieved your military objective. And this is what Israel is lacking at the moment.
So there's two parts of that I want to ask you about. The first is those war goals, the war aims, the original objectives Netanyahu went in with to Gaza post-October 7th last year. The key ones being the eradication of those that caused October 7th, the eradication of the Hamas command and control structure, and as much of Hamas as possible, it seemed, and the return of the hostages. Of course, some 100 hostages expected to still be in the Gaza Strip, and all of Hamas have certainly not eradicated. How much more do you think they will actually be able to achieve? How much longer do you think they're going to keep pushing in Gaza?
Well, I think the Israelis will continue to push in Gaza and to continue to do as much damage as they can to Hamas. But there's a limit to what they can achieve certainly in terms of total victory. I don't think that's possible. What they have been able to do is decimate the military forces of Hamas. But as we see in Jabalia, Hamas is able to reconstitute itself, to continue to attack Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. Also, in terms of the hostages, Israel has not been able to achieve the result that it wants through military means. There are still over 100 hostages. Perhaps half of them are alive. It's not clear exactly what the situation is. But the military force alone has not resulted in the release of the hostages. That will require diplomacy. That will require a ceasefire, but Israel seems to have scorned that approach and to continue its military operations against Hamas.
What do you make of the intended strategy as it was being discussed a few weeks ago? This was before the pager explosions, the walkie-talkie explosions that we saw across Lebanon, and then the military activity we saw by Israel in and around and above Lebanon, was this idea of escalate to de-escalate, just in order to get people around a negotiating table. Do you think there was anything to that?
Well, I'm not sure what a strategy of escalating to de-escalate really makes a lot of sense. The objective that the Israelis set in Lebanon is a little bit more achievable than in Gaza. What they said specifically was they wanted to create the conditions to allow the Israeli residents of northern Israel to return to their homes. That is a specific objective. It is achievable. They're using military means to achieve it now. But ultimately, it will require a ceasefire and diplomatic efforts to reestablish the situation that would prevail of the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. That's the bedrock resolution that the UN adopted after the end of the 2006 fighting. It was never fully implemented. So what Israel is trying to achieve, in fact, is to put that back into force. And to expel Hezbollah from the strip along the Lebanon-Israel border. That may be more achievable, but again, the fighting has been very difficult. Israel has done a lot of damage to Hezbollah militarily, but it's not clear that they can totally eradicate Hezbollah as well.
And that was the point I was going to come to, because you spoke in your first answer about your concerns for post-conflict Gaza and what would happen, and in terms of Israel trying to meet these military aims of decimating Hamas and now trying to decimate Hezbollah as well and take it out root and branch. And obviously concerns abound that this may instead radicalize new generations of people in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon as well to become Hamas and Hezbollah fighters. Do you think there's something to that?
I do. I think it's particularly a serious problem in Gaza. where you've got a large population, 2 million people, who've almost all been displaced from their homes. They were not very favorable to Israel to begin with, but they're now much more aggrieved with what Israel has done with the high casualty count, the displacement of people from their homes. So I think the next generation of Gazans will be even more willing to go into the ranks of Hamas to fight Israel. It's not a prospect that leads to peace in the long run. And that, I think, is one of the most damaging consequences of the fighting in Gaza over the past year.
Let's talk about what international players can do, if anything, at this point, particularly the US, where you're speaking to us from. Today, there was supposed to be a meeting between Israel's Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, and the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, to discuss Israel's military response, as is intended, to the Iranian missile barrage we saw on Israel around a week ago. That meeting was postponed. We understand from the Israeli side, the Pentagon spokesperson saying they didn't really have much more detail than that at the time, that there didn't appear to be tensions between the US and Israel. But what do you read into that?
My understanding is that the reason for the postponement has to do with Israeli internal politics more than anything else. That Prime Minister Netanyahu was not happy that the Defense Minister, Mr. Gallant, was traveling to Washington to talk about the response to the Iranian attack with his American counterparts. And President Biden had not yet spoken to the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister insisted that they have a conversation with President Biden first. That seems to be more about Israeli politics than anything else. The fact that the Israeli Defense Minister is unable to travel to Washington to discuss coordination and what's going on with his American counterparts seems very distressing to me. The Prime Minister will try to prevent something like that from happening.
That chimes in with an interview I had with a journalist, a Jerusalem-based Israeli journalist last night, who said that she was in the press briefing with the military forces about the latest activity that day, and they hadn't realized that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was putting out that statement last night in video on social media platforms, talking to the people of Lebanon, asking them to rise up against Hezbollah. And when the journalists asked the military spokespeople in the room about the statement, they weren't aware of it. So there clearly is, as you point out there seems to be a lack of communication or cohesion in the Israeli government at the moment. Is that what you would also read from that?
Yes, that's correct. And I think it's very troublesome that there's this lack of cohesion at the leadership level in Israel. When you have the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister at odds with each other, not coordinating with each other, not even speaking to each other in some cases, it's very worrisome about the future prospect of what Israel is trying to achieve. It makes Israel's goals seem even farther from being able to be achieved in that situation.
In terms of an Israeli response to last week's Iranian missile barrage, which we must remember was intense, and we hadn't seen anything like that for quite some time, missiles fired directly from Iran over onto Israel, there has been this expected significant response from Israel. President Biden saying he would not support an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear or energy in response to the missile attack on Israel last week. He said the response should be proportionate. What would proportionate look like?
Well, it's hard to be specific, and I think the Israelis are being careful about what they're doing, and they are trying to coordinate with the United States. I think it's true that both Israel and Iran do not want a wider war if they can avoid it. They've certainly been willing to attack each other, but within certain limits and certain boundaries. So the Israelis are searching for a way to hit Iran back hard in response to what they did a week ago in Israel, but not so hard as to precipitate a full-scale war, which could be quite dangerous. The Iranians, for their part, I think also want to avoid a wider war. I think they're afraid of Israel's military might. They're also afraid of the United States, which could come to Israel's assistance if the fighting gets out of control. So both sides seemingly want to avoid a war, but in this kind of situation, a miscalculation by either side could set off a much bigger conflagration, even if both parties do not really want that to happen.
I mean, in terms of those calculations, there was reporting that Israel reportedly cancelled an attack plan because there were rumours that Iran might be conducting its first ever nuclear bomb test, which would, of course, be absolutely catastrophic in terms of if we saw that type of escalation. Does this mean that we are seeing Israel showing restraint?
Well, I don't know that it's restraint, but I think Israel is trying to be cautious and to try to basically thread the needle to find a way to hit back in Iran hard, but not so hard as to precipitate a spiral out of control. So the fact that Israel has waited and not acted precipitously, I think that's at least a good sign that they're trying to think through what are the consequences of their actions here.
Let's think about some of the other players as well outside of the US. Turkey has been one in particular that's been interesting to watch over the course of the last week. On the anniversary of October 7th, President Erdogan releasing a statement, once again calling what Israel's actions are in Gaza, particularly a genocide. Turkey since then announcing it's going to send 2 Navy ships to Lebanon, but saying that's for the evacuation of Turkish citizens. What do you think of Turkey's part in all of this? Do they have a critical role to play? How much pressure gets applied?
Well, I don't think Turkey has a really critical role to play. They've chosen sides in this battle. They've taken the side of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they've been very critical of Israel. As you mentioned, they refer to Israel's actions as genocide. So they have very little influence with Israel anymore. So while they're clearly trying to play a role, they don't have the relationship with both sides that is necessary to play a critical role here. What's been more effective is the combination of the United States and Qatar and Egypt trying to negotiate a ceasefire. While the Americans don't have contacts with Hamas or Hezbollah, working with Egypt and Qatar is a way of bridging that gap and trying to find an outcome. Of course, the United States and Qatar and Egypt have not been successful so far, but it's not due to a lack of trying. It's more a result of the fact that Israel and Hamas have incompatible goals in Gaza right now that have been impossible to bridge.
Do you think we could see a sort of re-emergence of those types of meetings, of firing up at them again? Because as you said, over the course of the last year, we did see a lot of mediation happening. Egypt, Qatar, Gulf states as well. Do you think we might finally see people really trying to get round a table? Because, you know, since the Lebanon situation really escalated, there doesn't appear to have been as much as there has been effort-wise in terms of securing a ceasefire.
Right. I think the mediators will try again. I think it's inevitable that there will be a ceasefire at some point. It's hard to see that right now, given the gaps between the two sides. But the only way out of this situation is through a ceasefire that includes Gaza and Lebanon as well. So I expect that the United States, working again with Egypt and Qatar, will make another effort again to try to accomplish that. And
with the United States, obviously, we are heading into an election for you guys over there in the coming weeks. And in terms of Biden doing what he can in the last days of his administration, if Harris was to win, Kamala Harris for the Democrats, how do you think she would be handling this the minute she got into office? Because it's presumably still going to be a very big ongoing issue.
Well, I think the issue will continue. You're right about that. The next president won't take office until January, whether that's Vice President Harris or the Republican candidate Donald Trump. So there's still quite a bit of time between now and then that the Biden administration will have to take charge of this matter. I'm not sure exactly how a new president would handle this issue. Both of the candidates are in the midst of a very tough election battle right now. They're trying to gain whatever advantages possible. So they're not really speaking in clear terms about what their policies would be on this issue. And it's hard to predict. Again, since they will not take office until January, the situation on the ground in Gaza, in Lebanon, and between Israel and Iran will certainly evolve between now and then. So they will be reacting to events that have not yet happened yet.
And it became such a polarizing issue in the United Kingdom. I'm thinking, because I was working there over the summer, in terms of the way people actually thought and voted when there was a general election happening there, and it actually had impact on who could run in certain constituencies, as we call them in the UK, because people were so either pro-Palestine or so pro-Israel. The issue has become so divisive and polarizing. Is that the case in the US as well when it comes to voters?
Well, at a national level, I don't think this issue will play that much in terms of the election outcome. But the way our system works, of course, we have the Electoral College. So the votes are basically state by state. And in some states, particularly Michigan, where there are a large number of Arab American residents, it could have an impact. And given the closeness of this campaign and the election right now, any one state might be the tipping point between the two sides. So while at a national level, the issue is not decisive, it could be decisive at a local level, which could have a big impact on the outcome of the race.
Mr. Wallace, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for speaking to us about a range of issues.
My pleasure.
Joe Biden has been forced to withdraw from what would have been the highest level meeting of Ukrainian donors in Germany as the US president cancelled his trip to focus on the hurricane in Florida. The now postponed gathering, considered crucial to advancing the victory plan presented by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to allies last month, was intended to reaffirm steadfast support for Kyiv and secure additional aid commitments ahead of winter months. Now, this does come as Russia's defense ministry says it captured 2 more settlements in eastern Ukraine, the latest gains in their drive to take full control of the Donbass region. Although recent territorial losses seemingly point to Moscow winning on the battlefield, Ukraine is saying their strategy is trading space for Russian losses. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warning Ukraine faces its most difficult winter since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Well, I'm joined now by the former US Ambassador to Ukraine and now Senior Director at the Atlantic Council, John Herbst. John, thank you for making time for us. And in terms of, let's start with those words from the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, saying that Ukraine faces its most difficult winter, and that's saying something because it's been a few winters now. What do you make of that? How do you assess the current state of things for Ukraine?
If you talk about the winter, what he's referring to principally is the massive attack over the past 6 or so months on Ukraine's energy grid. And they've lost 9 gigawatts of power, which is a startling amount. So the difficult winter they faced 2 years ago will be even more difficult this year. That I think is the main thing. But on the battlefield, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please talk to us about what your assessment of the battlefield.
On the battlefield, it's true that Russia took the town of Vuhledar, a town they've been trying to take for many months, actually for over a year, a week or so ago. And that was a tactical victory for the Russians. But as the BBC reported, the Russians took enormous casualties for an elite unit there. And as the infamous Russian hyper-nationalist Gerasim Strelkov wrote on Telegram, this is actually a strategic defeat for Russia because they've been taking so many casualties for tiny incremental gains in Ukraine. So the war on the battlefield is not going as badly as many Westerners talk about it.
Talk to me about then what do you think of this supposed Ukrainian strategy to essentially kind of deplete Russian resources and military? Do you think that will prove effective?
I think it is having a substantial, for Ukraine, positive impact. But it is true that Russia does have far more resources to Ukraine, and Putin seems willing to sacrifice his soldiers in these kamikaze attacks, in which most of them are killed. So this remains to be seen. I just think it's premature to say that Moscow's got the upper hand, especially as we watch the remarkable effectiveness of Ukraine's drone strikes on ammunition depots and military bases in Ukraine. The third major depot, in this time the Bryansk Oblast in Russia, was struck just last night.
I'll come back to the drone attacks and the ongoing efforts by Ukraine in the western regions of Russia. But in terms of the Russian forces and the military, so we can get a sense of that, the health of them currently. I mean, we're getting even reports, and this albeit from South Korean Defense Ministry at the moment, that North Korean soldiers are dying whilst fighting alongside Russian soldiers in Ukraine. How wide do you think this draft is going for Russia in order to get enough men on the battlefield?
Putin does have problems conscripting. We saw what happened when he announced his partial mobilization 2 years ago. There was great political unhappiness. He's managed to get by increasing the pay for volunteer soldiers, but also by rough methods of conscription in the outlying areas of Russia and in the non-ethnic Russian parts of Russia. Eventually, this may come back to bite him, but right now he seems to be able to manage. But reports of the Russians seeking soldiers in the global south, seeking soldiers from Central Asia, now seeking soldiers from North Korea, point to the fact that this is not a particularly popular war in Russia itself, which is a problem for Putin.
Now, returning to those drone strikes that you mentioned there, Russia's air defense unit saying they destroyed 47 Ukrainian drones targeting its west. How are Ukrainian efforts going, do you think, especially in regions like Kursk?
Well, the drone campaign has been remarkably successful. The idea in a drone attack is you send a swarm of them, and air defense systems take down some, but the rest get through to their targets. And that's what happened last night. Russian sources say they shot down a bunch of Ukrainian drones. They don't mention that a major arms depot in Bryansk was hit, and it is now lighting up the skies there. And this follows, of course, their massive attack in the Tver Oblast, which registered as something between 2.8 or 3.2 on the Richter scale. The explosions were so massive. And then the successful attacks after that in Krasnodar. So this is something which is seriously complicating the Russian war effort, and that obviously is a very good thing.
Now, away from the battlefield, as you mentioned there, potentially the Ukrainian efforts are going much better than some would think, some detractors and some cynics. So let's think about the political side of things. Biden, of course, having to withdraw from this meeting of big donors in Germany, understandably big hurricane hitting southeast US at the moment. But at this meeting, we're expecting Zelensky of Ukraine to draw up his victory plan to end the war, and that's widely expected to focus heavily on this demand to have these long-range missiles that you can fire deep into Russia. Can you see any Ukrainian allies getting behind that plan?
Well, I think that half of NATO, maybe more, strongly believe that Zelensky should be able to use the American ATACMS and the British longer-range missiles on targets in Russia. The problem is you have a White House that has been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats, something once again brought to light by the recent book put out by Bob Woodward. And this is both very bad international politics, and it makes the United States look weak.
Indeed, this book by Bob Woodward you mentioned, just in case our viewers aren't aware, this famous Watergate journalist with some absolutely bombshell exposés about particularly Donald Trump's relationship with Putin during his time in office and then post-presidency as well, talking about several private phone calls with Putin since leaving office and also giving Putin COVID testing machines in 2020. This is according to the book War. Also, as you mentioned there, the idea of Putin actually selectively using nuclear weaponry as part of the conflict. I mean, how do you think, obviously the headlines have already come out about this, but will this surprise anyone? And will it change the impact of the US election at all, the way people think about Trump?
I don't think it's going to surprise many people. Will it have an impact on the election? I'm not sure. People who support Trump tend to discount the mainstream media, and they may well simply discount this book, although it should not be discounted. But it is true that the election will be decided on the margins, and the voters who have not made up their mind yet, some of those who've been skeptical of Trump for various reasons may find this is one more reason to vote against him. So, but it's still too hard to say precisely what impact this will have, if any, on the election.
Interesting. And obviously the main, I believe, thesis of the book is trying to explore Trump as a power player on the global stage and whether or not he is as influential as he claims he is, especially with regard to what some people call strongman leaders, people like Putin and others around the world. What about the fears that Harris would not be strong enough to face those types of leaders? Do you think a Harris foreign policy agenda is a continuation of the Biden administration?
To be fair, it's not fully clear, but certainly the people around Harris, like Phil Gordon, have long been colleagues of the current national security leaders like Blinken and Sullivan. And his writings and instincts seem to fall in a similar cast. But of course, ultimately it depends on the main person. So what would Harris do? She doesn't have nearly the experience of Biden. But I think expecting something similar to the Biden administration, including on Russia's aggression in Ukraine, is probably sound.
Let's return a moment to the weapons, because you mentioned something interesting there. Beyond the long-range missiles that Zelensky has been asking for to fire, if he needed to, into Russia. An interesting report recently, the US military's top commander in Europe compiled this weapons list of US weaponry, essentially, that Ukraine could use in its fight against Russia, but hasn't been supplied so far. This includes air-to-surface missiles and a secure communications network used by NATO. So for the outsiders approaching this, can you explain to us potentially why that hasn't been made available to Ukraine yet?
I can't be certain about the communications equipment. Regarding the surface-to-air missiles, which also have a range like our ATACMS of several hundred kilometers, this once again comes back to the excessive caution, which is a polite way to phrase it, of the White House because of Putin's constant nuclear bluster. Nuclear weapons are not a joke. Russia is the only pure nuclear power out there with us. So we have to look at this very seriously, but we should not be self-deterring because of Putin's bluster, because we've already passed, and Ukraine has passed, many of his alleged red lines for the possible use of nuclear weapons. And never before in American diplomatic history have senior officials said publicly that we cannot do something because our adversary is threatening the use of nukes. That was true during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was true during the Berlin Crisis. We never did that. And that's just a sign of weakness.
Are we reaching a state of sort of mutually assured destruction once again, that kind of the need for that balance?
Correct. Well, we have that balance. We need to operate as if we're a superpower and not be intimidated by a far weaker adversary like Russia.
In terms of if Putin is to succeed in Ukraine, what does that look like if it did indeed happen over the course of the coming months? What could happen thereon?
If he succeeds in Ukraine, he's going to create more difficult problems for his neighbors, including perhaps for his NATO neighbors. Biden has several times said, he needs to say it more often, that if Putin wins in Ukraine, he may well move forward and attack a NATO state. We already see massive provocations against NATO from the Russians right now. Sabotage operations, cyber attacks, overflight of NATO territories with bombs heading for Ukraine. And the response to all this has been pretty much nothing. So he's already undermining NATO right now while he's fighting a major war in Ukraine. American national interests, NATO countries' national interests, require a Putin defeat in Ukraine. Biden sort of understands that, although he's never made the strong case to the American people. Sadly, the naive wing of the Republican Party seems not to understand that at all.
In terms of an attack potentially on a NATO country, do you feel like enough, particularly European, I'm thinking because they're the closest NATO countries, are alive to that threat? Because obviously the cohesion of the EU with member states like Hungary causing issues over previous years as well. Do you think there is enough sense of danger and alertness now, given that the war has gone on for so long?
I don't have any doubt that most of the Eastern European members of NATO, the exceptions, of course, being Hungary and Slovakia, understand how dangerous a Putin victory in Ukraine would be for them. They've been sounding the alarm about Russian aggression since it began in 2014, when leaders in Germany and France were nonchalant and basically unaware of the dangers. So they understand this because their independence could very much be on the line. And having lived under the Russian boot, not just in Soviet times, but before, they don't want to return to that. So they get it. But it's leaders further west that have not fully understood it. And again, we have very timid leadership coming from Washington, and less important, but also important, even more timid leadership in Berlin.
Interesting. Look, sir, it would be remiss of us, whilst we have you, to not ask you about the situation in the Middle East. I hope you don't mind the slight pivot here, but you were also US Consul General in Jerusalem at some point in your career. So I want to ask you how you assess the current situation in Lebanon and Gaza and Israel's strategy there.
Israel is doing very important and positive things right now in severely diminishing Hezbollah's military capability and demonstrating that the aggressive authoritarians can be beaten. The Russians are not the only ones we need to worry about globally. We have to worry about the Chinese. We have to worry about the North Koreans and the Iranians. And they've been working ever more closely together. We, the United States, have not enabled Ukraine to win this war. And we could if the White House was not so timid. But Israel, despite Washington's urgings not to do this, is proceeding with delivering a heavy blow, not just to Hezbollah, but also to Iran. And that's a very good thing. And the problems that Israel is creating for Iran may means that Iran's not going to be able to send nearly as many drones and missiles to Russia to destroy the electricity grid in Ukraine and to kill Ukrainian civilians. And that's also a good thing. But American timidity is even greater in the Middle East than it is in Europe, because, the Iranian proxies have been sending missiles against not just international shipping, but our shipping, our Navy in the Red Sea. Iranian proxies have launched hundreds of attacks on American soldiers stationed in the northern Levant. And as we all know, 3 soldiers died in one of those attacks a few months ago. And after that attack, we struck back moderately hard, only moderately. If we had struck back hard against the first attacks, perhaps those soldiers would be alive today. And there, too, the Biden administration obsesses about quote-unquote escalation. It does not seem to realize that weakness is more likely to provoke escalation than strength.
Really interesting getting your view on that, particularly the way as it pertains to the relationship between Iran and Russia. But I just want to pick up on your earlier point you made in that answer, which was that Israel's it's acting as it wants now. It's not waiting for permission from the US. Did you think during your time there that now we would see this point where Israel is behaving as it sees fit, regardless of global concerns or global criticism?
Well, I worked on and in the Middle East for a good portion of my career. And the pattern we're seeing today is not new. Basically, when Israel would be at war, usually because it had been attacked, we would say fine at the beginning. We, the United States, would say fine at the beginning. And then at a certain point, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks into the war, we would say, well, maybe Israel's now time to calm down. And they would usually not calm down, in other words, not desist for a while past our urgings, and then eventually they would stop. This time, so it fits an old pattern, but I suspect because the caution in the White House is greater today, and the need for Israel to strike decisively is greater today, the period before Israel decides to listen to our caution will be longer this time.
Really interesting. And you mentioned also that you believe that Israel's, if they achieve a decimation of Hezbollah, would be beneficial, of course, as you said. I hope I'm not misquoting you here, to US, to others in the world as well. But do you think they can? There's no doubt about it. Do you think they can satisfy those aims?
I think they've already largely incapacitated Hezbollah. Not completely. They will not be able to destroy it completely. But what they've done to thousands of Hezbollah fighters, and to not just the old Hezbollah leadership, Nasrallah, who was in power for over 30 years, but the guys who replaced him, is crushing. And it will take Hezbollah years to recover, if ever.
It's been really fascinating speaking to you. Thank you for your time. Former US Ambassador to Ukraine and now Senior Director at the Atlantic Council, John Herbst.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.